Greetings, everyone. Keep in mind that for today we're focusing on ideology and that every religion in the world has its extremist elements. Chapter 10 in the political ideologies class is talking about radical Islamism. So let's talk a little bit about Islam first. Islam is actually translated in the word submission. Begins in 620 in the AD era by Muhammad, a collection of reporting and revelations by Muhammad that make up the Quran. This is a monotheistic type of religion, believing in one God, focusing on how to live your life, a way of life, and submission of the individual's will to Allah, the God, supreme God. It caught on fairly quickly, relatively speaking, and within a century spread throughout the Middle East, North Africa, in Spain. Quite a bit of influence culturally with the diverse societies that sprang up in these regions that were also embracing Islam. Things like algebra and architecture have their roots in the Islamic societies. This was diffused to the Europeans. In Islam, faith and law of the land are one and the same. This is what we call Sharia. That's why the Muslim states are typically theocracies, because it's the religious doctrine that, above all, is what the law of the land is as well. Muslims in general tend to identify more strongly with their religion than their country. That will come up again a little bit later when we compare this with nationalism. Now, the Sunni versus Shia split, two major sects or groups in Islam, are kind of at the heart of the problems and differences that they have internally, which then have led to some extremist elements, which we'll get into even in more detail in the next lecture. Fairly complicated divide here, but originally split as to who was going to follow Muhammad, and of course how to interpret the Quran. Just like in any religion, arguments over interpretation. A couple of other examples of differences here is that in the Sunni group, caliphate is elected chief executive, whereas in the Shia group, caliph is divinely gifted imam. They both share this idea of a jihad, which is an internal struggle, your own individual will versus the will of Allah. But the extremists, which we'll get into here in a little bit more detail, struggle against primarily the external enemies. And unfortunately, when you have a major split like this, the external enemy could be this other group as well. Also, a common theme is that secularism, which we've talked about before, is seen as betrayal of the faith, and secularism often gets equated to modernization. Now, while Islam is a religion, what we have to distinguish here is that the radical and fundamental elements of Islam that we'll be talking about do qualify as an ideology, which is then puts them in a separate category here. And when we particularly look at the products of the radical or the fundamental elements, particularly when we get to some of the terrorist elements here, makes it worth examining. But we also have to keep in mind that every religion in the world has its extremist elements. In this case, as we'll talk about later, the conditions within a country are conducive as to whether or not those extremist elements are going to flourish and then become terrorist groups. So we'll have to make that distinction as well later on. Early on, there was threats to Islam, as you can imagine, as they were growing quite rapidly in the Mediterranean area. In this 200-year period, there was the Crusades, military conquest to retake the Holy Land for Christianity. Moving ahead, the European imperial expansion that we've touched on already a little bit, as far as the formation of the state, domination through colonialism. But the European imperial expansion went into North Africa and the Middle East from the 1800s into the early 1900s, particularly the French and British, and that has also been a sore spot even to this day as far as these imperial conquests. Another thing that the Islam region had a problem with was the establishment of the state of Israel, the Jewish people, in 1948. From their view, it was considered an insult to the Muslims to have a state established there in their midst, and for the UN as well as the US to recognize them as a state. And then a big part of what we'll talk about here with the extremist and the fundamentalist elements is the influence of Western modernism, the pushback against that of sexuality, equality of women, the spread, the appeal of amorality, the cultural media that diffuses all these elements into the society. Then another aspect here is that Saudi Arabia, ally of the United States, supported the U.S. during the Gulf War, where we were in Saudi Arabia mobilizing to prepare to push Saddam Hussein back out of Kuwait. Osama bin Laden was very much opposed to this, to the point where Osama bin Laden pushed back against his own country for supporting the U.S. effort here, and Saudi Arabia actually exiled him from the country, and that's when Osama bin Laden went to North Africa and formed Al-Qaeda. These are the primary Muslim states of the world. We'll be talking about in the next lecture where some of the hot spots are as far as conflict, particularly that may be motivated by terrorist activity. Talking about radical Islamism, it has its roots all the way back into the counter-enlightenment that we've already touched on, particularly the reactions against humanism, secularism, that then evolve into modernism and modernization, materialism, consumerism, things like that. But the reactionaries are looking to restore Islam back to its pure state as to when it was formed in this under this religious doctrine. The biggest influence of current radical Islamism was Syed Qutb, who was a writer, philosopher somewhat. He was an outspoken critic of Egypt's king post-World War II, went to the United States to be educated in the late 1940s. And while he was there, he was an observer of American culture and gradually was very turned off by several aspects of American culture, particularly the racism. As we start to get into the civil rights era, racism was a norm in some areas. The vast inequality, the increasing promiscuity, the use of alcohol, again, the secularism of the society, the materialism of the society, the support of Israel. So there was lots of things that Qutb was not very happy about in the American culture. He joins the Muslim Brotherhood, and upon returning to Egypt, becomes very critical of Abdul Nasser's secular program of modernization, particularly in the 50s. He was arrested a couple of times. Finally, in 1966, he was arrested again for plotting an overthrow of Nasser's secularist regime and eventually executed, which gave him somewhat of a martyr status to his followers, and then has become very influential in the radical Islamist thinking. So looking at Qutb's general philosophy, most Muslims disagree with his radical interpretation. So that's what we have to keep in mind. We have to be very careful of stereotyping, because radical Islam is a minority element. But what Qutb was focusing on is the conspiracy of the Jews and the Christians to allegedly corrupt morals of Islam. Also talking about how the Western influence drags Muslims into what he referred to as a spiritual darkness, posed the idea that reason and individuality can replace God's will. Talk about that here in a minute as to why radical Islam in particular is pushing back against liberal democracies because of this right here. Another thing is that liberalism, in his eyes, does not recognize the true sovereignty of God. So therefore man cannot put his faith in, I guess you could say, representative governments and liberal democracies and individual freedoms and things like that. Sovereignty of God is above that. So that has a tendency to attract the more extremist elements that could then evolve into even more fundamentalist radical type groups. Not surprising, the radical Islamist way of thinking has a vanguard party that needs to lead everyone else. And so what that ends up being is that a few people who consider themselves the most devout are taking upon themselves to lead the way, and in this case to prepare to give their lives in a struggle against Western aggressors. And as you can see, this has the formations of terrorist groups here where people are willing to strap a bomb to themselves and give their lives in order to do this. Now, this is where it starts to get problematic within the Islamic religion, because the Sunni-Shia divide has precipitated to where Muslims can now justify attacking Muslims who have betrayed the faith, or at least the faith as to how they interpret it. This has led to the assassination of Anwar Sadat, as we'll talk about here in a minute, who was trying to compromise with the, particularly in the aftermath of the Camp David Accords, coming into a treaty with Israel. Also, the opposition to Saddam Hussein, a more secularist leaning leader who was quite adamant of keeping radical elements out of Iraq. So the suicide bombers would become, therefore, martyrs and used to justify ridding the world of infidels or unbelievers. And then it also has quite a bit of dependence upon indoctrination of youth into this radical interpretation of the Quran, and then that would also help to recruit members into the fundamentalist or the extremist sect of this religion, and then potentially recruiting terrorist activity from there. Looking at the radical Islamic version of nature, humans are generally weak and must overcome temptation with the jihad, the internal struggle of the individual will versus the belief in the God, through prayer and in a wider community of believers. So the radical, and of course we've got lots of paradoxes and dilemmas here, is that if the idea here is to unite all Muslims into a wider community of believers, well then all these different sectarian divides is working against that as well, particularly the Sunni-Shia divide. The version of nature is anti-individualist. You can't have rights such as personal freedoms and liberties and property rights against what gives you the moral guidance, and the religious doctrine is what gives you the moral guidance, not your own individual freedoms and rights. Various divisions that we'll focus on as far as the extremist versions later on, but the Sufi and the populist versions, particularly that predominate Indonesia, which is a majority Muslim nation, but fairly low on terrorist activity. They favor more toleration. On the other side of the spectrum here, the Salafis, Taliban, Wahhabis reject modernity, as well as the Sufi mysticism. Here's a major breakdown of the Islam groups, major divide between the Sunni and the Shia. The circles represent somewhat of a percentage of adherents. Sunni has the biggest group, breaks off into these sects here that are within these countries, majority in those countries there. The Wahhabi and Salafi sect groups there predominate in Saudi Arabia. The more extremist elements over the past few decades have come out of the Wahhabi group there, including Osama bin Laden, who formed Al-Qaeda from the extremist of this group right here. And the terrorists for 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia as well. On the Shia side, we've got these groups here. The Alawis, for example, are the minority in Syria that was instrumental in their Arab Spring uprising against Assad, has led to the civil war that is still creating havoc in Syria. As far as the radical Islamic version of freedom, the reactionaries are looking at a reversal of modernization to push back against that and go back to the ways of religious doctrine. The modernization is dragging nation down to the bottom, particularly with secularist values, the things that I talked about with Qutb's philosophy. Freedom is defined as submission to the supreme will. Freedom of man from servitude to other men. So being obligated to governments and other leaders is not freedom from this perspective. Freedom is being submissive to the religious doctrine. So without Islam, man therefore lives as a slave and then would require an armed struggle to expel the infidels. So these radical interpretations potentially lead to terrorist activity. When we look at radical Islam versus moderate Islam, the radicals, once we get to that extreme, justify killing of innocents, such as Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, because he negotiated with the enemy, in this case with the State of Israel, in order to create a very influential treaty there that was negotiated or moderated by the United States. Osama bin Laden interpreted that Western civilians are not innocent if they agree to a war on terror of its government's policies. Now, of course, what is a little ironic there is that the government agreed to the war on terror after the destruction of 9/11. But nevertheless, as we'll get to when we talk about the principles of terrorism, or what separates terrorism apart, is that justifying the killing of innocent civilians. The moderates espouse a more liberal view, and that religion is primarily a means to bettering yourself. Quran can be interpreted in light of new knowledge. So these are logical differences between an extremist interpretation of the doctrine as opposed to interpreting it as society evolves. Status of women has a long way to go in Islam societies. In many states, women are not eligible to vote. In Afghanistan, where we've spent 20 years in the aftermath of 9/11 trying to influence them in becoming a representative democracy, even though they are very unstable even to this day. The Afghanistan Constitution originally excluded women from the ruling council. They did eventually come up with requiring quotas to have a certain number of women in their Congress, but the women were then still segregated from the men in those chambers. And the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly in Egypt in 2013, still advocated for women to remain in the framework controlled by men. It was one of the problems with Egypt that we'll see here in a minute, is because of some of the beliefs of the Muslim Brotherhood, that for women would have to ask permission from men. There were some cases where the beatings by the husband were blamed on the women, and women no inheritance rights. Those are just some of the things that the textbooks talks about as far as the status of women. Egypt is an interesting situation. We've touched on it already before. That's where Qutb originated from. Lots of activity in Egypt over the years, but in 2012, after a couple of decades of dictatorship, Mubarak was pressured to step down. Now, clearly Egypt is an ally of the United States, and yes, he was a dictator, but he was an ally. The United States was originally fairly sympathetic with the ousting of Mubarak in order to, and again, this was part of that Arab Spring uprising that swept across North Africa on into Middle East, into Syria, and it's had quite mixed results. But in 2012, Egypt had its first parliamentary election in its history. Now, interestingly enough, not necessarily the radical Islamists, but Islamists were pushing back against Mubarak in that he was a secularist-leaning regime and pro-United States. So that's part of what inspires the opposition. So the Islamists win about 75% of the seats of their parliament, and typically the leader is, in most parliamentary type systems, in this case whether it's the president or the prime minister, comes out of that majority party. So the president was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but that almost immediately created some opposition to that. The Supreme Court, the highest court in Egypt, which was still mostly appointed by Mubarak, they dissolved the parliament as a result. And then one thing led to another, and a military takeover in 2013. The new president, who was actually part of that military coup, President al-Sisi, did promise elections and was reelected in 2018 with 97% of the vote. So that's almost statistically impossible. So that shows you how all opposition was prevented. There was a very small turnout. There was crackdown on any dissent. So it still has a ways to go in Egypt with respect to their consolidation of democracy. Looking at Islamism versus nationalism, because there may be a tendency to kind of confuse these a little bit. The radical ideology in particular is rooted in religion, not a nation, nor any devotion to a state. As I said before, the Islamists are typically loyal to their religious doctrine, not to a state, and even more so as we get into the radical ideology. Transnational movements are to unite Muslims of different nationalities and ethnic groups, so they're kind of spanning across borders, but of course that has lots of problems as well when we look at the major Sunni versus Shia divide that prevents that uniting, and then could even present more opportunity for conflict, because the two biggest powers in the region, Iran and Saudi Arabia, they are allied with the two opposite groups of Islam. Iran is aligned with the Shia side, Saudi Arabia aligned with the Sunni side. So that is going to present problems right off the bat. Fascism, as we talked about, which is the nationalist ideology, requires loyalty to the state and ultimately with a powerful man in charge. However, that kind of loyalty from the Muslim point of view would be deserved only by Allah. All right, so what we touched on here is some general overview of Islam, but then talking about radical Islamism in that it presents itself as an ideology that is worth examining, and then when the radical and extremist elements turn into terrorist groups or engage in terrorist activity, that requires even more effort to examine, understand, and try to prevent. So that's why I want to break this one down into a couple of different lectures, and I'll pick up with the next lecture talking more about terrorism in particular.